Alright, so in this video we're checking out the RunCam Thumb 2. This is the follow-up to the last one I reviewed, the Thumb Pro W, which was the wide-angled version of the Thumb Pro. There are actually two versions of the Thumb Pro, 145-degree lens and a 155-degree lens. This one comes with a 160-degree lens. And the big takeaway for this new model is that it has 4K 60 frames per second and 2.7K 60 frames per second. So in order to do 60 frames per second, they had to redo the whole form factor, obviously make it bigger, adding more processing, has a slightly updated sensor. We'll talk about the image quality later in the video. I got quite a bit to say about that and some samples to show you. And with all these additional hardware features, the camera is now quite a bit heavier. So the previous version was 16 grams, and this one's coming in, well, they're advertising it coming in at 27 grams. And just on my scale here, it's 27.5 grams, but that's including the micro SD card that's installed. So in addition to the camera, of course, which has already installed a lens protector, which is Corning Gorilla Glass, which is nice. It's going to be more resistant to scratches. What I got in my set here included the ND filters, but this is an extra cost. I think it's an extra $10 for these. So you get an 8, 16, and 24. 24 is kind of unusual. I'm surprised they went with 24 instead of 32. So it's $110. It's $99 just for the camera. But they sent along the ND filters, obviously, for this testing. You got a manual, of course. I will show you what's in the manual, as well as some instructions that you'll probably need to pay attention to later. There's a USB-C cable to these wires here. This is for UART camera control, so you can set it up on your Betaflight and transmitter and use your switches to control the camera in terms of starting and stopping the recording. And you can see here is where the USB-C port is. So UART control was in the previous version, but the new feature in this version is PWM control, and it's with this, it just looks like a analog camera cable, like it has power, ground, and the yellow you would think is video out, but it's not. There's no analog video out on this one. It is for this here, PWM control, so you can just plug this in here, again wire this up to your flight controller, and then you can have remote control as well via this cable instead. So they do talk about this in the mail. I'll show you that here in a second. The feature that you can have with USB-C here is when you plug it into your computer, it will default and show up as a basically as a USB drive, and then you can press the button to switch it over to webcam mode. So if you want to use this as a 4K webcam, you can do that as well. They do also include this mount with this, it's like a long M3 screw and nut. So you get the mount for the camera and then the mount part for the drone. And this mount just happens to fit my Diatune F4 just fine. For the two front screws, and then for the back there's no screw hole here, so I kind of jerry-rigged something and put a screw there to hold it down in place. Works pretty good. I don't get any jello or no vibrations. Because I need 5 volts to the camera, I added a just a 5 volts voltage regulator here, BEC, and then I just plug this into the camera. It kind of works like a naked GoPro. Alright, here's a quick look at the manual, and just pause the video if you want to look at it in case I'm going to kind of rush through this here. Nothing really that important. I'm going to cover most of the stuff in the video anyway. It talks about the camera mounting. You do need a very fast U3 micro SD card. If you don't, basically it won't record and you get an error. And then it talks about the power supply. You don't want to exceed 5 volts, and same for the USB port. You don't want to exceed 5 volts there either. And then this talks about how to set up the remote control stuff, the PWM to the flight controller. Now for the UART stuff, I talked about that in the previous video. I will link that in the video description. That was from November of 2022, I believe. It's been a while since that last camera came out. And then basic instructions, and this does have this LED here on the outside, and this is the button for controlling the camera. Basically long press to turn it on, and then short press to start recording. And then there's the double press to put it into QR code mode. It's the same as before, but you have a green and red LED indicating what the camera is doing, and that is what this is talking about here. So again, I'm not going to read all this off. You can pause the video and read this for yourself if you'd like. And then there's additional configuration stuff here, the QR code stuff. I will show you that here in a second in the app. Some very important stuff to point out. And it talks about the PC connection. You can either have it as a USB disk or UVC mode, which is video out for webcam mode. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate that for you because my USB port is dead. So it did work at first. So I plugged this in a few times so that I could just access the SD card without having to pop it out every time, because I had left it in the drone, and then where the SD card slot is where the mount is right here. It's kind of like it's going to go like kind of like this, and then so I would, instead of having to pull it out, I would just plug it into the computer, and then it would power the camera on, and then it would show up as a USB disk, a USB drive, and then I would just copy the files off that way. So that worked pretty good for the first 3 days, and then it stopped working. So I plugged in USB, and it doesn't power on anymore. So I'm not sure what happened. The camera still seems to work when it's powered in from the back here, but any kind of power is coming from the USB-C port doesn't work for me anymore. So I did report this to RunCam. Obviously, these are probably early samples. Certainly, some of the kinks needs to still be worked out, but this is par for the course for RunCam. When I reviewed the original Thumb, which is the 1080p camera, then the Thumb Pro and the Thumb Pro W, the version 1.0 that I received all had issues. So, not surprised at all. Okay, so here are the specs. This one here has the IMX586 sensor, and they're saying it's 4800 megapixels. That I think they meant to say 48 megapixels because I've never seen anything 4800. It's too big. And then these are all the different resolutions. Of course, the 4K 60 is the big one, and the 2.7K 60. And then here are the dimensions, in case you're wondering. Here this says it's 24 grams, but obviously, as I showed you, it's 27.5 grams. And just for comparison to the previous version, the RunCam Thumb Pro, that one had a 12 megapixel sensor, the IMX577, and it has the two lenses, 145 and 155, and that one weighed 16 grams. So it was also a bit smaller as well. So the camera increased in size, increased in weight, but you get the 60 frames per second, which is the biggest thing about this camera. All right, and I want to show you the app. It works just like before. You can set up your QR codes. So you see the Thumb Pro here and the RunCam Thumb 2, new camera. Go in here and then hit your QR code configuration. Got your different settings here. I believe these are, I'm not 100% sure these are stock. I think, high video quality is high, or video quality at high is 100 megabits per second. So the bit rate is the highest out of all the Thumb series from RunCam. I think the previous version was like 50 megabits, but it was only 30 frames per second, so that's fine. So we have obviously the new resolutions here. Again, still a 4:3 sensor as well, so you have the ability to record in 4:3. And then this does do gyroflow as well. That is unchanged. You can hear, you get the gyroscope data, or you can do basically in-camera stabilization. So you have normal stabilization and super stabilization. In my samples, I just went with gyroflow stabilization. I didn't test these other two because the stabilization in the last camera was not nearly as good as gyroflow, and most people will want to go with that route anyway. Go over to the next tab here. We have some additional settings: image rotation, saturation, exposure, contrast, sharpness, metering mode, white balance. This is the one thing that I changed on the last sample. I'll show you that. I'll talk about the samples here in a second. Change the white balance to sunny versus auto, and then we have the power supply frequency and the video standard. Now, if you take a look at this, what do you think is missing here? Something pretty important. Can you guys guess? Let me show you what the Thumb Pro settings are like, just so you can see for comparison. Here's the Thumb Pro, the previous version. Go in here, and we have the basically pretty similar settings here: 4K 30, volume, shutter, ISO sensitivity, color style. These are the three that you don't see in the new camera. So you can't manually set shutter, which is important when using ND filters to get better video. You can't set the ISO. That's locked at auto on the new camera. So again, this is the Thumb Pro, the last version, not the new one. And then the color style. So there's normal and flat. That's gone too as well. Now I know this is version 1 firmware. They may add this in the coming days. Perhaps by the time you see this video, that firmware will be already out. I have version 1.0 firmware, and these things don't exist in the app or in the camera, which is important, shouldn't it? Because especially with this basically the sensors that RunCam uses for this, these are budget cameras. The dynamic range isn't the greatest, so you really need to lock in that shutter and use ND filters so that you don't have these basically really harsh changes in exposure, especially when you're going from dark scenes to light scenes, and then basically you see the sky is exposed, and then when the ground gets exposed, the sky turns completely white, like it's basically overblown in terms of the exposure. You can't make any details out. So you could compensate for that by, I guess, going here and maybe adjusting the exposure setting here. Use the ND filter, maybe go down like to -1. That might help. You're gonna lose your details in the shadows when you do this, but you might be able to bring it back in post-processing. But let me just talk about the 3 samples here, and I will link them down in the video description if you want to see them in its entirety. But I'm just going to show you short clips of each as I talk about them. So the first clip here is just flying around, bright sunny day, no ND filters, just with the lens guard, completely 100% stock settings. And out of all the tweaking I've done, this is probably the best that you're going to see or get right now, at least on version 1 firmware. It's all right. It did seem like to me it was a little bit, the contrast seemed a little bit too high and the sharpness seemed a little bit too high. So I thought maybe I could adjust that down a little bit. It might help. I don't know. You guys can look at this footage and, tell me if this looks any better or worse than the previous camera. So I can't do any side-by-side comparisons because I don't have the previous camera anymore. I gave one away like 6 months ago, and the last one I had, I lost in a crash. So fortunately I can't do any side-by-sides, but you can go back and look at the previous review. I do have footage in that review, of course, and then you can see if the image quality is that much better. In terms of overall image quality, it seems like the new camera is slightly better. It's not a huge difference. Obviously, it's 60 frames per second now instead of 30 frames per second. But here in the second sample here, I tried to reduce the sharpness. I moved it from medium to low, and it went from looking maybe a little bit over sharpened to kind of blurry, like out of focus in some situations, especially in low light when you go into the trees. So I'm not sure if that's an improvement. I think that I would stay away from low sharpness and just stick with medium. Maybe they could bump the default down a little bit. I think the biggest thing might be the contrast. I got to play with it, of course, some more, but I'm kind of waiting for the next version of the firmware before I do additional testing, because I think some of these things are going to change anyway. So maybe all this analysis of the image quality in version 1.0 firmware could be rather moot or pointless or obsolete by the time you see this video. I did use an ND16 filter in this second clip here you're seeing at the park. And the other thing I noticed, and this particular flight, is that the audio and video are out of sync. So you'll notice this when I crash into the tree. You'll hear, I think the audio came first, and then you see the video afterwards. It doesn't seem to be out of sync every time that you record, but maybe about half the time it's in sync, and then the other half of the time it's out of sync. And again, I think this is an issue with just because it's early firmware, version 1.0. So, I think that probably Yeah, the firmware needs a little bit more work. We're going to have to wait and see what happens, but yeah, definitely the firmware needs a little bit more work. Now in this last clip here, I basically just took the camera and I connected it to a battery and put it on my hat, and I'm riding a scooter here, just to show you a little bit sort of a different kind of clip where I'm just kind of riding around in the neighborhood. And if you watched any of my other e-bike and scooter videos, go back and look at footage of this basically the same street on those reviews. I go on the same street over and over again, and all that footage is from a Hero 11 Mini or a Hero 12. They're pretty similar, so you guys can compare the image quality there. It's pretty decent, except for the wide dynamic range, because you can't control the shutter speed. So in terms of overall detail and sharpness, pretty decent, I think, in this scooter footage here. But I think that if you do get this camera and you happen to get it with version 1.0 firmware, I would just stick with the stock settings and use an ND filter and maybe bump down the EV compensation. I think that'll probably give you the best results for what we have right now. Anyway, I'll have more content on this a little bit later. Obviously, there'll be more firmware updates. They're probably going to fix some bugs. Maybe the audio-video sync issue will go away. We'll see. I'll have another video later, so stay tuned to my channel and be subscribed, turn your notifications on so you don't miss that video, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.